Hello and welcome back. I'm Raj Kletke. In this video I'll be discussing multiple Trico Spinner Falls and very briefly a Trico Emergence that I fished this last season. We'll see what we can learn, look at a few potential surprises, and then near the end of the video try to tie a better Trico spinner pattern or two. But first, you may want to review Part 2 and Part 3 of my Fly Fishing Hatches series dealing with fishing the Trico Spinner Fall. These videos include a general discussion of Tricos, ties the basic L-style polywing Trico, and show some basic casting methods to use during a Trico Spinner Fall. Like my blue-winged olive fishing that I did early in 2018, I fished mainly in the Midwest driftless area in July when the Trico hatches were just starting, and out west in September when the Trico hatches had been going and had already been fished heavily daily for several months. In my most recent video on blue-winged olives, I tried to emphasize some important differences between fishing the less fished waters and heavily fished waters. Most of these differences apply to Trico spinner fishing also, and again, heavily fished waters can be challenging, but there is at least one important difference that may actually be an advantage when fishing super hatches like the Trico Spinner Fall on heavily fished waters. The same crowds of fishermen that helped create many of the challenges mentioned in the most recent video also means that trout get used to the presence of fishermen in these heavily fished waters. So during a super hatch on heavily fished waters, you can commonly get closer to the trout as they often continue feeding even though they're aware of your presence. This does not mean that sloppy waiting is okay, because you can still put the fish down. But if you do, the fish are more likely to quickly resume feeding, while in the less heavily fished waters, the trout get spooked quickly by poor waiting and are slower to return to feeding after being put down. I suspect this is true because trout have to eat and can't miss the food from super hatches regularly. On the heavily fished waters, like those we fished out west in September, fishermen are literally present almost all day, starting with Tricos in the morning, blue-winged olives in the afternoon, and pale evening duns in the late afternoon and evening. This wasn't true in July, so when I spooked trout in the Midwest, they often stopped feeding and didn't return until I moved to another pod. Interestingly, there are times that the pattern selection on heavily fished waters isn't as important as we think. Of course, you still want a reasonable pattern for Trico fishing on any water. The standard L-style polywing Trico that we tied in the Fly Fishing Hatches series usually works well and did in the Midwest again this year. I didn't even try other patterns. This fishing was, of course, early in the Trico Emergence and Spinner Fall period, and Spinner Falls were only moderate. The Tricos were sparse enough that trout targeted individual spinners and never got into rhythmic feeding, where my fly had to compete with numerous naturals. Out west, it still worked, but not as consistently. Out west, we got 3 days of heavy spinner falls, and sometimes trout did establish rhythmic feeding. Incidentally, one tail is broken off in this picture. Tricos, like all crawler mayflies, have 3 tails as adults. Out west, I also had an almost perfect situation to fish the spinner fall in, so I was able to experiment with multiple different wing materials and many different patterns. Most of these patterns took at least one trout. But some of these takes were what I call passive takes. I was upstream and casting slightly angled downstream. I'd cast above the trout and significantly past the feeding lane, then pull my fly into the trout's feeding lane and let my fly drift with the numerous naturals as the trout rhythmically bobbed up to take a mouthful of Trico spinners. If my fly wasn't taken, I'd let it drift past the fish, slowly lead it to the side, and then recast. It would sometimes take numerous casts, but as long as my fly wasn't too obnoxious, accuracy and timing were far more important than the pattern. I could clearly see the trout, and they could clearly see me, as I was often only 15-20 feet directly upstream of them. But they were just below the surface, so their window was very small. They were concentrating on the food in front of them, and because of the crowds, they're used to ignoring fishermen. Of course, most fishermen were fishing a Trico spinner pattern, and trout had been seeing these same patterns for several months. Surprisingly, the three largest trout I caught during the Trico Spinner Fall were all active takes on my indicator fly, a size 18 elk-hair caddis. Maybe this shouldn't have been so surprising, as random caddis are common on these waters and rarely used by fishermen during a Trico Spinner Fall. Possibly the trout aren't as wary of caddis patterns as they are of Trico Spinner patterns during the Trico Spinner Fall. However, be careful with tandem rigs in irregular currents, as the two flies can pull on one another and destroy good drifts. So when trout are rhythmically feeding on matted masses of Trico spinners, accurate casting and timing are often more important than the pattern. Use a pattern you can see. If you're not that accurate, pull your fly into the feeding lane as I did. But when spinners are sparse and the trout seem to be targeting individual spinners, the pattern again becomes very important. This is a Trico spinner, likely a male. Sorry, I don't have a good Trico female dun picture, but again note the large thorax that Tricos have. I did fish one Trico Emergence last year. It is always surprising how relatively few Tricos are emerging in the morning after I've seen the heavy spinner falls the day before. But remember, the males have emerged during the night, and many of the emerging females crawl up vegetation or rocks to emerge, so not all Tricos are surface emergers. The emerging females had olive abdomens, and my size 22 blue-winged olive low-riding parachute pattern worked with standard dry fly techniques. If I was tying a dun specifically for the Tricos, however, I'd put on a wider thorax and a more trapezoidal-shaped abdomen. Be sure to tie up some size 22 parachutes or other small dun patterns so you'll be ready for a Trico Emergence also. So, now before we end this series, let's try to design and tie a better Trico spinner pattern or two. Tying a more effective pattern, however, is not easy. Patterns have become standard because they are effective. I generally recommend tying and using standard patterns. You fish more confidently with patterns that you know catch fish. But sometimes, especially in heavily fished waters, fish get accustomed to the standard patterns, and it's fun to try to design your own fly. If you're a pretty serious fly fisherman and fly tyer, use your knowledge of entomology and lots of observation and try this. Who knows, you may design the next killer pattern. So, how do you go about designing a new pattern? What factors should play into your design? Hewitt's factors, written many years ago, still have relevance today. Many apply to designing a fly. Note that the light effects of the fly on the water and behavior are at the top of his list, and that size, shape, and color might be important also. Accuracy to the natural is of lesser importance, so don't get carried away trying to get complete accuracy at the expense of the other factors. Also, spend time examining the organism you're trying to imitate. This past year, I closely watched Trico spinners on the surface of the water and closely examined many Trico spinners under magnification. I also tried many pattern variations. Obviously, take this anecdotal experience very cautiously. Trout may not feel the same way that I do. But I don't believe the number or even the presence of tails matter. The wing length doesn't seem to matter as much as I originally thought. I'm undecided about the importance of the width of the wing. Only rarely do the spent wings trap air, causing a sparkle, but the leading and back edge of the wing may cause a sparkle by causing surface indentation and light effects. The indentation on the surface of the water by the large thorax was obvious to me, and I feel likely significant to the trout. While I was surprised at how much variation in size the spinners had, there were size 18 to 24 present on the water at the same time. Most were about a size 22 this year, and I think smaller size is important. I tie mainly with a black thorax and a dark olive abdomen, supposedly the female spinner, but I also tie a few with dark brown thorax and abdomens like the male spinners. Both males and females were present on the water at the same time, not clearly as separated in time as I've read about, and color, at least within the ranges that I tie, did not seem to matter. A surprise to me was that the spinners I observed weren't completely dead, as I had put on this slide from my Fly Fishing Hatches series. When picking the spinners from the surface, almost all were slightly alive and actively moving their feet. Since I believe that micro movement may be a trigger, I'm trying to tie patterns with a few wisps of spikes of dubbing in the thorax to represent legs this year. But still fish spinners with a dead drift, of course. There wasn't any obvious movement to the spinner. My first variation is simply adding a leading edge of crystal flash to the poly wing. Actually, I've done this for a while now. This makes sense, as the best Trico Spinner Falls that I've seen have been on bright sunny days, so crystal flash will sparkle. As you attach your wing, keep the crystal flash longer than the poly wing, which makes it easy to pull the crystal flash to the leading edge of the wing as you put in your cross ties. Remember, I'm tying an L style Trico, which is a reverse style, so the leading edge of the wing is at the hook bend. I'm trying a spiky dubbing this winter to represent the legs, as I've discussed earlier. I complete the wide thorax and finish the fly as we did with tying Al's Trico in my Fly Fishing Hatches series. I trim the crystal flash and poly to the wing length. I also cut off the excessive spikiness on the dorsal surface. Other than taking slightly longer to tie, I've not noticed a downside to this pattern. It does work, but I'm not completely convinced that it's that much better than the standard tie. But I'll be trying this pattern more this year. Another pattern, again basically Al's style, a reverse tie, I'll be trying takes significantly longer to tie, but I'll have some for especially difficult cases, likely the Spinner Falls out west this season. First, I tie on a long strand of crystal flash for the leading edge of the wing near the hook bend. Next, I tie in the poly spent wing in the usual fashion. Add the spiky dubbing and make the wide thorax at least 2 millimeters, incorporating the crystal flash and poly similar to the previous fly. I build up the body to the Trico trapezoidal shape and take my thread back to near the eye of the hook. And now the hard part. I loop the crystal flash back, forming a spent looped wing with the leading and trailing edge of the wing composed of the crystal flash and the poly representing the central veining within the loop. I leave the crystal flash tied off near the eye of the hook to give a wide wing, or move it slightly towards the thorax as I've done here. I trim the excessive spikiness from the top of the fly, but leave the bottom spikiness for the legs. I'll let you know how this works next year. Now go and design your better Trico pattern and let me know next year how it worked for you. Well, that's it for my 2019 winter fly fishing series. The snow's gone and the insects are starting to hatch. It's time to get back on the streams. I hope you have a good year, and just maybe my videos have inspired you to tie some new patterns, try some new techniques, and even learn some more entomology. If they did, it was a successful series. But now it's time to get out on the streams and rivers, as that's where the real learning comes from. I'm Raj Kletke, and I hope to see you next year.